He had worked in the hospital for almost 10 years, quietly moving through the halls at night while most people slept. The smell of disinfectant, the hum of machines, and the distant beeping of monitors had become a strange kind of comfort to him. It was a life that was far from glamorous, far from the dreams he once had, but it paid the bills, and it gave him something more important: time with his daughter. Tonight, however, felt different. He knew it was the last night he would walk these halls as a janitor. The hospital administration had decided to cut costs, and his position had been one of the first on the list. He had tried to stay positive when they told him, but the news had hit him harder than he expected. It wasn't just about the money. It was the feeling of being replaced, of being invisible, of watching the routine he had known for years vanish overnight. He pushed his mop down the corridor with practiced precision, eyes scanning for spots and spills, though tonight he barely noticed them. His mind was elsewhere. He thought about his daughter waiting at home, probably drawing in her coloring book or maybe falling asleep too early, thinking her father was still working somewhere. He wondered if she would ask why he didn't have a job anymore. He tried not to imagine the disappointment in her small eyes. It was something he couldn't bear. She had already lost her mother years ago, and now he worried he might fail her in a different way. He had promised her that everything would be okay, that they would always have each other. But promises felt fragile under the weight of bills and responsibilities. As he moved from room to room, he greeted the occasional night nurse or cleaning staff with a tired smile. No one paid much attention to him. He was always there, always quiet, always dependable. That had become his pattern, his way of existing in a world that rarely noticed people like him. He thought about how strange it was that no one ever asked about his life outside the hospital. No one knew that he had once been someone very different, someone who had held positions that required skill, courage, and quick thinking. But that life was behind him. Now he was just a janitor, and tonight it was a title he would no longer hold. He paused outside a patient room where a young boy was struggling to sleep, his small hand clutching a worn-out stuffed animal. The boy's mother looked exhausted, sitting beside him with worry etched across her face. The janitor knocked lightly on the doorframe and offered a small, comforting nod. "Everything okay in here?" he asked quietly. The mother managed a small smile, nodding. "Thanks. You always help keep things calm around here," she said. He didn't say much in response. That was the way of his world-small gestures, unnoticed kindness, keeping life moving for everyone else. He finished his rounds in the room, wiping down surfaces and checking that everything was in order. He didn't linger. Tonight, every room seemed to hold a weight that matched his own. He moved on to the emergency hallway, where the fluorescent lights flickered just slightly, creating brief shadows on the walls. He had always liked this part of the hospital. It was chaotic, unpredictable, and yet somehow alive. He remembered the first night he had walked these halls, nervous and unsure, trying not to make mistakes. Now, years later, he moved with the certainty of someone who knew every corner, every squeaky floorboard, every smell and sound. He had become invisible in a way that only comes from being needed, but never praised. He thought about how strange it was that no one seemed to notice him until something went wrong. That had been his life, fixing small problems quietly and moving on without recognition. In the staff lounge, he stopped for a moment to drink some lukewarm coffee. The cup was chipped and the coffee bitter, but it was familiar. He sat down on the worn-out chair, staring at the peeling paint on the walls, thinking about the day ahead, or rather, the absence of the day ahead. Tomorrow, he would wake up without a job, without the routine that had structured his life for years. He wondered how he would explain it to his daughter. She was young, but she would notice. She always noticed. He sipped the coffee slowly, trying to savor the warmth, trying to give himself a small comfort in a world that suddenly felt colder. Finishing his coffee, he returned to the halls to do one last sweep. He moved past the rooms where patients slept, past the nurses who were busy with charts and medication, and past the waiting areas where families sat, exhausted and anxious. He stopped briefly by a door that had jammed earlier in the evening. A nurse had struggled with it, and he had quietly fixed it, unnoticed and unthanked. That was his way solving problems quietly, never asking for recognition. He pushed the door gently, testing the latch, and it clicked open smoothly. A small sense of satisfaction filled him, a reminder that even tonight, on his last shift, he could still make a difference, even if no one knew Dot as he continued down the corridor. He noticed the night felt unusually still. The usual hum of machines and distant chatter seemed muted, as if the building itself knew tonight was different. He passed by the hospital chapel, where a small candle burned in the dark, and paused briefly. He had never been a religious man, but he allowed himself a silent thought, a quiet hope that somehow things would work out for him and his daughter. He pushed on, finishing his rounds with careful attention to detail, making sure the floors were clean, the trash emptied, and everything in order. It was the last time he would do this job, and he wanted to leave everything as perfect as he could. Finally, he approached the main exit, carrying a small box of personal items he had collected over the years, a few photos, a coffee mug, and a small, faded keychain his daughter had made him. The weight of it felt heavier than the box itself. He paused at the door, looking back at the long halls he had walked so many nights, the patients he had watched over, the nurses and doctors who had gone about their work without noticing him. It had been a quiet life, unremarkable in the eyes of others, but it had been filled with small acts of care, small victories, and the knowledge that he had done his best to keep people safe, even in the shadows. He sighed and pushed the door open, stepping out into the cool night air. The city was quiet, the streets empty, and the world seemed to stretch endlessly before him. He felt a pang of fear, wondering what would come next. How would he support his daughter? How would he find a place where he could be needed again, where his skills and his heart could make a difference? He walked slowly to his car, the box of belongings resting on the passenger seat, and started the engine. The road ahead was uncertain, and for the first time in a long time, he felt the weight of the unknown pressing down on him. But deep inside, there was a flicker of determination. He had faced challenges before, and he would face them again, not just for himself, but for the little girl who believed in him more than anyone else ever had. Dot, as he drove home, his mind wandered to small memories of his daughter, her laughter, her questions, the way she held his hand tightly when she was scared. She was the reason he had endured long nights, low wages, and the quiet invisibility of his job. She was the reason he had kept going, even when hope seemed distant. Tonight, even in the shadow of losing his job, he promised himself he would find a way to keep that promise to her. He would find a way to make things right, to keep their lives moving forward, even when the world seemed determined to slow them down. And as the hospital disappeared in the rearview mirror, he allowed himself a small, hopeful thought. Maybe this ending was not really an ending, but the start of something he had never imagined. He drove slowly through the quiet streets, the night air cool against his face, and tried not to let his thoughts drift too far into worry. But it was impossible. Losing his job was more than just losing income. It was the first time he truly felt the weight of being alone in the world, responsible for another life that depended entirely on him. He glanced at the small box of belongings on the passenger seat, his hands tightening on the steering wheel. Those items represented more than years of work. They represented the life he had tried to build for his daughter, the life he had sacrificed so much to protect Dot as he drove. Memories he had long kept buried began to rise. Memories of a different time, a different man he once was. He had been trained for dangerous work, jobs that required courage, skill, and calm under pressure. He had dealt with emergencies most people couldn't even imagine, situations that demanded decisions in seconds and actions that could save or end lives. It was a world that thrilled him once, a world he had excelled in. But after his wife passed away, he had walked away from it all. The danger was no longer something he could take on. He had a daughter to raise, a little girl who needed him safe every day. That decision had changed everything. The world had become quieter, smaller, and safer, but it came at a cost. He had hidden that past from nearly everyone. People at the hospital knew him as a janitor who quietly did his work, never seeking attention, never causing trouble. No one knew the man he had been, the skills he had mastered, or the challenges he had faced. It was a secret life, tucked away so his daughter could grow up in peace, untouched by the chaos he once thrived in. He remembered nights when he had stayed awake, haunted by what could have happened, and mornings when he had smiled for his daughter, pretending everything was fine. He had made sacrifices quietly, without complaint, because it was the right thing to do. But now, on the night he lost his job, those memories felt heavier, more urgent. As he turned onto a main road, he noticed the distant glow of city lights reflecting off low clouds. The quiet streets gave him a moment to breathe, but also forced him to confront the reality he had been avoiding. Bills were due, rent was looming, and he had no immediate plan for how to provide for his daughter. The fear gnawed at him, but he pushed it aside. He had faced fear before, in ways most people could not imagine, and he had always found a way through. This was different, yes, but he reminded himself that he could handle it. He had to for her. Driving brought him to a familiar neighborhood, the one where he had moved after losing his wife. The small house was modest, but full of warmth. He parked, grabbed the box of belongings, and walked to the front door. The porch light flickered on automatically, casting a soft glow over the steps. He unlocked the door, stepped inside, and immediately felt the contrast between the bustling, chaotic hospital and the quiet, lived-in safety of home. His daughter was curled up on the couch with a blanket, a coloring book forgotten in her lap, eyes heavy with sleep. She looked up as he entered, blinking slowly, and a small, tired smile spread across her face. "Hi, Dad," she whispered, her voice soft. "Hey, kiddo," he replied gently, kneeling to set the box down. "How was your evening?" "Okay," she mumbled, rubbing her eyes. "Did you have a good day?" He hesitated, searching for the right words. How could he explain to her that his day had ended with the loss of his job, that tomorrow would be uncertain, and that he didn't know how they would make it? He forced a small smile, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "It was fine," he said. "Just another day at work." He didn't want to worry her. Not tonight. After tucking her into bed, he sat in the dim light of the living room, thinking about his life. The walls around him were decorated with drawings and school projects, each one a reminder of why he had chosen to leave his old life behind. He thought about the dangerous jobs, the emergencies, the adrenaline-filled moments he had once lived for. All of it seemed distant now, like a story from someone else's life. And yet, he knew those skills had never truly left him. They were still part of him, waiting quietly beneath the surface. He had buried them for years, but tonight, the thought lingered. Maybe he hadn't seen the last of that life. He poured himself a cup of tea and sat by the window, staring out at the dark street. The quiet night made him think about the world beyond his neighborhood, about situations where people needed help and no one else could provide it. He remembered how it felt to be called into action, the sense of responsibility and focus that came with being the person others relied on when things went wrong. That life had seemed like a memory for years, replaced by the routines of hospital cleaning, the small kindnesses, the unnoticed work. But tonight it felt alive again, like a spark beneath the surface, reminding him that he still had abilities most people couldn't even imagine. The thought both excited and frightened him. He had left that life behind for a reason. The dangers, the unpredictability, the fear, it had been too much when he had someone depending on him every day. But now, without a job, without certainty, he wondered if perhaps fate had other plans. He tried to push the thought aside, focusing instead on practical concerns. How to pay the bills, how to make ends meet, how to reassure his daughter that everything would be okay. It was a lot for one night, and yet he felt a strange calm beneath the surface. He had faced challenges before, and somehow he had always found a way. Sleep didn't come easily that night. He lay awake, listening to the quiet hum of the house, the occasional car passing by, the soft breathing of his daughter in the next room. He thought about the hospital halls, the patients, the nurses, and doctors who never noticed him, and he thought about the skills he had left behind. There was a strange tension in him, a mixture of fear, uncertainty, and a faint sense of anticipation, though he didn't know why. He wondered what tomorrow would bring, how they would survive, and if the life he had buried would ever call to him again. That morning came slowly. The sunlight streamed through the curtains, warm and gentle, and his daughter stirred, blinking against the light. He smiled at her, brushing her hair from her face, and promised himself that he would face whatever came within calm and strength. Today was uncertain. Yes, but he had faced uncertainty before, and he would do it again. He would find a way to keep his daughter safe, to make a life for them. Even if the path ahead was unknown. As they had breakfast, he thought about the world outside, the world he had once been part of, the world of emergencies and quick decisions, of lives hanging in the balance. It seemed so far away now, yet part of him wondered if it would ever come calling again. He shook the thought from his mind and focused on the present, on his daughter, on the small joys and routines of their life. She needed him grounded, stable, and hopeful. She needed him to believe in tomorrow, even when he wasn't sure what it would bring. By the time he walked out the door to face the day, he carried both the weight of the past and the hope of the future. The past reminded him of what he was capable of the strength he had gained through hardship. The future, uncertain as it was, held possibilities he had never imagined. And as he stepped into the sunlight, the city waking around him, he held on to one thought above all. No matter what came, he would find a way to protect and provide for the little girl who depended on him. And he would not fail her. Little did he know. The skills he thought were buried, the abilities he had left behind, were about to become more important than he could have ever imagined. The quiet life he had built, the invisible routine he had relied on for years, was about to collide with a world that needed him in ways he had thought were long behind him. And though he did not yet know it, this was only the beginning of a journey that would test everything he had learned, both in his past life and in the life he had built for his daughter. The morning air was crisp, and the streets were quiet as he drove toward the city center. He had planned to stop by a few places to ask about potential jobs, hoping that something, anything, would come through for him and his daughter. As he drove, he noticed the distant roar of helicopters overhead. At first, he thought it was routine traffic or some emergency training he had seen before, but the sound grew louder, heavier, more urgent. He looked up, squinting into the sunlit sky, and saw not one, but 3 large helicopters slicing through the air toward the city. Their engines screamed with power, and the wind from their rotors stirred dust and leaves along the empty streets. Curiosity and unease filled him as he parked at the side of the road. He watched as the helicopters circled, their movements purposeful, precise. They weren't part of a show or an exercise. This was real, and they were coming for something or someone. His pulse quickened as a small, nagging feeling tickled the back of his mind, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. Something about this scene stirred a part of him he had buried deep, the part of him trained to notice danger. To respond, to act out before he could move, one of the helicopters touched down in an open lot nearby, the ground trembling beneath the force of its rotors. Dust and debris swirled around, and he instinctively stepped back, shielding his face. He felt his heart rate increase as figures in uniforms began moving with urgency, shouting orders to each other. They were not hospital staff, not security, not police. These were trained professionals, and they were clearly searching for someone with very specific skills. One of the officers looked directly at him as he emerged from his car, shielding his eyes from the sun and dust. The man shouted over the roar of the helicopter, calling a name he hadn't heard in years his own. For a moment, he froze, unsure if he had heard correctly. Could it be that they knew who he was? Did they know what he had done in the past? Questions raced through his mind, and a mixture of fear, disbelief, and curiosity coursed through him. They ran toward him, urgency in their step, their expressions a mix of relief and determination. One of them grabbed his shoulder and said, "We need you, now." He stared at them, stunned. "Me? You have the wrong person," he said, his voice shaking slightly. I'm just a janitor. I don't know what you're talking about." But they ignored his protests. Another officer pulled out a tablet, showing him images of a disaster site already in progress, a place where skilled hands and quick decisions were critical to saving lives. The realization hit him like a punch in the chest. Something terrible was happening, and they needed him because of skills he thought he had left behind forever. The same skills he had buried for his daughter, the ones he had promised never to use again. They were calling him back, and there was no room for hesitation. He looked around. The helicopters hovered nearby, the rotors still sending gusts of wind in every direction. The officers were ready to take him away, and there was a sense of life-or-death urgency in their eyes. His mind raced. Could he leave his daughter behind? She was the reason he had abandoned this life in the first place, and the thought of her alone at home terrified him. But then he looked at the images again, saw the people in danger, and felt the undeniable pull of responsibility. He had trained for situations like this. He knew he could help, and if not him, then who? He took a deep breath, forcing calm into his voice. "Okay," he said finally, "but I need to know. I need to know I can come back. I have someone depending on me." The officer nodded, understanding in his eyes. "We'll get you back safely. We need you now more than ever." With that, he was led to the nearest helicopter. The wind from the rotor blades whipped his hair and clothes, and he felt a familiar adrenaline rush, a sensation he hadn't felt in years. It was equal parts terrifying and exhilarating. The helicopter lifted off the ground, and he looked down at the city below. Everything seemed small from this height. The streets, the buildings, the people, yet the problem ahead loomed large. Impossible even, until he realized it was now in his hand's dot as the helicopter raced toward the disaster site. He thought about the life he had left behind and the quiet years spent as a janitor. The contrast was stark, from cleaning floors and emptying trash to flying into a crisis where every decision could save or cost lives. But deep down, he felt a strange comfort. This was the part of him that had never truly gone away. He had trained, he had survived, and now he was being asked to do what he did best. The site came into view, a collapsed structure, emergency lights flashing, smoke rising in the distance. Teams of professionals were already on the ground, some struggling with equipment, others coordinating rescue efforts. The chaos was palpable, and he felt his old instincts kick in. He observed the situation with sharp, practiced eyes, noting weak points, potential hazards, and the people who needed immediate attention. In an instant, he began giving instructions, his voice calm but authoritative. Cutting through the panic like a knife through fog dot, the younger responders looked at him in surprise. Who was this man giving orders? Why was everyone listening to him? And yet, there was no question in their minds. He knew what he was doing. He moved among the teams, assessing, directing, helping, saving. Every action was precise, every decision calculated, and slowly the impossible began to feel achievable. Lives were being protected, dangers mitigated, and the chaos began to take order under his guidance. Minutes turned into hours. The sun climbed higher, and still he worked, moving from one critical point to another. His body was tired, his mind strained, but the adrenaline and focus kept him going. He had never felt more alive, and yet he couldn't help but think of his daughter, of the small, safe home he had left behind. The thought fueled him. He wasn't just doing this for duty or instinct. He was doing it so that he could come back, so that he could continue being her father, her protector in the everyday battles that mattered most. By late afternoon, the situation had improved significantly. The teams were no longer scrambling blindly. They were coordinated, efficient, and confident. And all of it was because of him, though no one outside the emergency response knew who he was. He had become the linchpin, the quiet force keeping disaster from turning into tragedy. Yet beneath the success, he felt a strange emptiness. The world had called him back to the life he had left, but it had done so without warning, without preparation. He had acted because he could, because he had no choice. And now he wondered what this meant for the life he had built. As the last of the immediate dangers were handled, and the helicopters lifted to bring reinforcements and supplies, he finally had a moment to breathe. He sat on a piece of debris, wiping sweat from his brow, and let himself look at what had just happened. Lives had been saved today, real lives, and he had been the one making the critical decisions. It was exhilarating, terrifying, and exhausting all at once. And yet, he knew that he would have to explain this to his daughter. How could he tell her that he had risked everything, returned to a life he had promised to leave behind, and survived because he knew things others didn't? The helicopter that had brought him to the site landed again to take him back. He climbed aboard, his muscles aching, his mind still alert but tired, and as the city disappeared below him, he felt a strange mix of pride and anxiety. He had done what was needed. He had saved lives. But the question lingered, what would come next? Could he return to the quiet life he had fought so hard to build? Or was this only the beginning of something far larger than he had ever anticipated? As the city shrank beneath him, he thought about his daughter, waiting at home, unaware of the day's events. He thought about the life he had chosen for her, the sacrifices he had made to keep her safe. And he promised himself, as he always had, that he would return. He would come back, no matter what, because she needed him more than the world needed him anywhere else. And yet, he knew that the world had a way of calling on him when he was least expecting it, testing his strength and reminding him of the man he once was and the man he still could be. The helicopter flew on, the engines roaring, carrying him back from a place of chaos to the city he knew, the home he loved, and the daughter who depended on him. He stared out the window, watching the streets below, and realized that life had a strange way of pulling people back into the roles they were meant to play. He had thought he was done with that life, but it had found him again, urgent and unavoidable. And deep inside, he felt ready. Ready because he had been trained. Ready because he had lived. Ready because there was someone waiting for him at home who believed in him more than anyone else ever could. The sun was beginning to dip low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the disaster site. The air was thick with dust and smoke, the smell of burned debris and chemical residue lingering heavily. He stepped carefully over rubble, his boots crunching against broken concrete, and surveyed the scene. Emergency teams were scattered, some trying to stabilize the structure, others attending to the injured. It was chaos, pure and overwhelming, but amid it all, he felt a strange calm settle over him. This was the kind of situation he had trained for years ago, the kind of pressure that had once made his heart pound with fear and adrenaline, the kind that now awakened something deep inside him. He moved swiftly from one group to another, giving concise instructions, correcting mistakes, and quietly directing teams without ever raising his voice unnecessarily. Each person he spoke to seemed to respond instinctively, as if they recognized authority without needing to know his story. It was uncanny to watch. He had left this world behind to protect his daughter, to create a safe life for her, yet here he was, thrust back into the heart of crisis because no one else had the experience, the knowledge, or the calm under pressure that he still carried. A young responder approached, panic written clearly on his face. "We can't get the support beam stabilized. The whole side could collapse." He crouched beside the man, scanning the weak points. "Use the cross braces over here. Tie them to the remaining supports, then reinforce with the sandbags. We don't have time for trial and error. Follow my instructions exactly." His hands moved quickly, showing the team how to attach ropes and secure beams in ways that none of them had considered. Within minutes, the side of the structure no longer teetered precariously. It was stable enough to allow them to move forward with the rescue dot as he continued. He found himself leading a group into the heart of the danger zone. Smoke choked the air, visibility was low, and the heat radiated from fires that had started along the debris. He spotted a young girl trapped beneath a fallen beam, her small cries barely audible over the chaos. He rushed forward, kneeling beside her. "It's okay. I've got you," he said, his voice calm, confident, soothing. "I'm going to get you out of here. You're safe with me?" The girl clutched his arm, trembling. He gently reassured her, moving methodically, ensuring every shift of the beam was calculated to avoid further collapse. The others watched in awe, their respect and trust growing with every decision he made. Slowly, he lifted the beam enough to free her, and she crawled out, hugging him tightly, crying with relief. The small act reminded him why he had left that world behind, to protect someone precious, to be present for the life that depended on him daily. He stepped back, breathing heavily, but never losing focus. The teams he directed moved like a well-oiled machine under his guidance. Every instruction, every adjustment, every small decision saved time, and in emergencies, time was lives. As the night deepened, the heat of the fires contrasted with the cooling air, and he worked tirelessly, moving from one dangerous area to another, his mind sharp, his movements precise. Every action was deliberate, born from years of experience that no one else possessed. During a brief pause, he looked around and noticed the younger responders watching him. They had never faced something of this magnitude before, and their eyes reflected awe and gratitude. One of them asked quietly, "How do you know all this?" He smiled faintly, brushing soot from his sleeve. "Experience," he said simply. "You'll learn quickly. Just keep calm and trust what you know." There was no bragging in his tone, no desire for recognition. Only the need to do the job correctly, to save lives, to ensure that chaos did not claim more than it already had. Hours passed, and the operation continued. He felt exhaustion gnawing at him, muscles aching, lungs burning from smoke, yet he pushed onward. Every life saved fueled him, reminded him of why he had been called back into this world. This was not just a job. It was a responsibility he could not ignore. Even as his body screamed for rest, his mind remained alert, analyzing structures, prioritizing tasks, and directing teams with unerring accuracy. At one point, A structural collapse threatened a group still inside the wreckage. Without hesitation, he dashed toward them, calculating the safest path through falling debris. He grabbed the nearest responders, guiding them through smoke and fire, shouting instructions over the roar of the chaos. They followed instinctively, trusting him completely. Moments later, all of them emerged, covered in dust and sweat but alive. Relief washed over the group, but there was no time to pause. The work was far from over, and he knew the night would be long. Amid the chaos, he found a small, quiet moment to look at the sky. The helicopters still circled above, their searchlights cutting through the darkness, shadows shifting across the ruins. He allowed himself a brief thought of home, of his daughter sleeping peacefully, unaware of the danger he was facing. That image gave him strength, a reminder that he was not just performing a job for strangers, he was proving to himself, in the most extreme way possible, that he could still protect, guide, and provide for those who depended on him. As the night wore on, the disaster site slowly transformed. What had once been chaos began to resemble order. Structures were stabilized, injured people evacuated, and the teams moved with growing confidence, following the path he had laid out. He was exhausted, his body shaking with fatigue, but he refused to stop. Every life mattered, and the moment he allowed himself to rest was a moment someone could be lost. He pressed forward, step by step, decision by decision, until the first rays of dawn broke across the horizon. By morning, the immediate danger had passed. The fires were under control, the structures reinforced, and the injured were on their way to hospitals for further care. The teams were tired but alive, and they owed their success to the quiet, relentless man who had walked among them like a force of nature. He finally allowed himself to sit, lean against a wall of rubble, and exhale deeply. He was covered in dirt and sweat, his clothes torn, but he felt an undeniable sense of accomplishment. He had done what others could not, had saved lives when seconds mattered, and had faced the chaos he thought he had left behind. Even in that moment of triumph, he couldn't forget the life waiting for him. He thought of his daughter, wondering if she would understand why he had been gone so long, why he had risked so much, and how he had survived. The thought made his chest tighten, a mix of longing and determination. He had done this for others, yes, but he had also done it for her, proving that he could rise to any challenge, no matter how impossible it seemed. As the sun climbed higher, he saw the helicopters return, ready to bring him back to the city. He rose slowly, muscles protesting, and walked toward them, each step reminding him of the nights he had spent cleaning hospital floors. Unnoticed, unthanked, yet preparing himself for moments exactly like this. The crews waved, expressing gratitude, some shaking his hand, others simply nodding in silent respect. None of them knew who he truly was, the man behind the janitor, but they felt the weight of his presence, the assurance that he had led them through the impossible. The helicopter lifted off, carrying him away from the site of destruction and toward a city waking to a new day. From above, he could see the small dots of life moving, streets and buildings alive with activity, unaware of the disaster that had unfolded, unaware of the quiet hero who had walked among chaos and emerged victorious. He let himself breathe, the tension in his body easing slightly, though the adrenaline still lingered. He knew he had survived, but he also knew that the life waiting for him, his life, his family, was as important as the lives he had just saved. As the city came into view, he allowed himself a small smile. He had faced chaos, danger, and exhaustion, and he had emerged stronger, more confident, and more aware of his own abilities. He had proven not to the world, but to himself, that the skills he thought he had left behind were still very much alive. And as the helicopter touched down, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. A reminder that while the world could call on him in extraordinary ways, the life he had built, the quiet, humble life for his daughter, was still the one that mattered most. He stepped from the helicopter, exhausted but alive, aware of the magnitude of what had just happened. The emergency teams dispersed, returning to their respective posts, leaving him with a rare moment of reflection. He was still the same man who had walked quietly through hospital halls as a janitor, yet he had proven he could also step into situations no one else could, saving lives when it mattered most. And as he headed toward the car that would take him home, he realized that the quiet life waiting for him, the little girl waiting for her father, was both a reward and a responsibility he would never take for granted. The events of the night would stay with him forever, a reminder of what he was capable of when the world needed him. But even more importantly, they reminded him why he had walked away from that life in the first place, to be there for the one person who mattered most, to ensure that the life he had built, fragile and imperfect as it might be, remained safe and whole. And as he drove toward home, he allowed himself the briefest thought of relief and hope. He had survived. He had done the impossible. And soon he would return to the one person who truly needed him. The drive home felt strangely quiet after the chaos he had just endured. The city was waking up, the streets filling with the usual morning noise cars honking, people rushing to work, deliveries being made. But for him, it was a world that felt almost surreal. He had returned from a disaster that had tested every skill, every instinct he had, and somehow, against all odds, he had survived. He had saved lives that no one else could have saved, guided people through impossible situations, and yet, the thought that pulled him most strongly was not of glory or recognition. It was of home, and the small, warm figure waiting for him there docked as he pulled into the driveway. His heart beat faster. The house looked the same as it always did, quiet, humble, safe. He grabbed the small box of belongings that had traveled with him for so long, now almost symbolic of the life he had left behind and the life he had fought to protect. The porch light flickered on, and for a moment he hesitated at the door. He could hear the faint sounds of someone moving inside, someone he had missed more than he realized. His daughter's laughter, soft but bright, carried through the hall as she played quietly with a small toy. Opening the door, he stepped inside, and the warm, familiar smell of home enveloped him. The small living room was filled with sunlight streaming through the curtains, illuminating the scattered toys, the coloring books, and the tiny chair his daughter loved to sit in. She looked up and froze for a moment, her eyes widening as she recognized him. Then she ran forward, arms outstretched. "Dad!" she shouted, her voice full of surprise and relief. She leapt into his arms, clinging tightly as if she would never let go. He hugged her back, holding her close, feeling the small weight of her body against his chest, the rapid beat of her little heart. "Hey, kiddo," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm home." She pulled back slightly, still holding his hands, her eyes searching his face. You were gone for so long. Where did you go?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. He knelt to be level with her, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. "I had to help some people," he said gently, careful not to frighten her. "Some people needed me, and I had to make sure they were safe. But I'm back now, and I'm not going anywhere. I promise." Her small hands tightened around his, and for the first time in days, he allowed himself to relax. The chaos, the danger, the exhaustion, they all faded for a moment, replaced by the simple, overwhelming relief of being home with her. He had faced danger he had thought he left behind, but now he was reminded why he had left it. To be here, to hold her, to be the steady presence in her life that no disaster, no crisis, no emergency could ever replace. After breakfast, he sat at the small kitchen table, still in his work clothes, trying to digest the events of the past 24 hours. The adrenaline was slowly wearing off, leaving behind a deep, bone-tired exhaustion, but also a quiet pride. He had done things today that he never imagined he would do again, and he had survived. He had saved lives, and now he had returned to the life that mattered most. He thought about the emergency teams, the helicopters, the chaos, and the way people hedge, and looked to him for guidance. He wondered if anyone outside the immediate responders would ever know what he had done. Probably not, but that didn't matter. Recognition had never been why he had done these things. He had acted because it was the right thing to do, because lives were at stake, and because he knew he could make a difference. Later in the morning, the doorbell rang. He opened it to find a small group of people from the emergency teams standing nervously on the porch. One of them stepped forward, holding a folder. "We don't know if you remember us," the man said, "but you saved a lot of lives yesterday. We wanted to thank you properly." They handed him a folder with letters of gratitude, small awards for his bravery, and even a note from some of the people he had rescued. He flipped through the letters slowly, reading each one, feeling a warmth in his chest he had not expected. It wasn't about fame or glory. It was about the acknowledgement that his actions mattered, that what he did had a real impact. His daughter peeked around his legs, curious and a little shy, watching the strangers with wide eyes. One of the responders knelt to her level, smiling. "You have a very brave dad," he said softly. "He's a hero." She looked up at him, her eyes shining. "I know," she said simply, her small voice full of pride. He smiled, ruffling her hair, feeling more content than he had in a long time. It wasn't the awards or the letters that mattered. It was her knowing and feeling that he had done something meaningful, that he had returned to her safely. After they left, he sat down with his daughter in the living room, letting the quiet of the house settle around them. They talked about small things, her school, her friends, the drawings she had made, the little stories she wanted to tell. The simplicity of it was grounding, a reminder that life continued even after extraordinary events, that normalcy could be found again after chaos in the afternoon. He called the hospital where he had worked, unsure of how to explain his absence or what had happened. The receptionist answered, recognizing his voice immediately. "We heard what happened," she said quietly. "Everyone is talking about it. You really saved lives." He thanked her, but felt a strange humility. He had acted instinctively, relying on skills he thought were gone. He had done what he needed to do, and now, more than anything, he wanted to ensure he could continue the life he had built with his daughter. It was enough that she knew that he had been there for her in the past, and that he would continue to be there for her in the future. That evening came, and he and his daughter sat together on the small porch, watching the sun set. The sky was painted with shades of orange and pink, and the world seemed to exhale, as if acknowledging that the worst had passed. She leaned against him, small and trusting, and he felt a deep sense of peace. All the fear, the uncertainty, the exhaustion, it was gone, replaced by the quiet assurance that they had each other. And that was enough to face anything. Later that night, as she slept, he sat alone in the living room, reflecting on the past days. He had lost his job, faced the most dangerous situations he had ever encountered, and returned home to find life waiting for him, unchanged, yet somehow richer. He realized that heroism wasn't about recognition or glory. It was about responsibility, courage, and the quiet moments when no one else could do what needed to be done. He had proven to himself, more than anyone else, that he could rise to any challenge and still return to the life that mattered most. He knew that life would not always be easy. Bills still needed to be paid, challenges would arise, and his daughter's world would continue to depend on his presence. But he felt stronger, more certain, and more ready than ever to face whatever came next. The events of the past day had reminded him of his own resilience, his own strength, and the importance of protecting those who depended on him. The next morning, he woke early, his daughter still sleeping peacefully. He quietly prepared breakfast, letting himself smile at the thought that life had a way of testing people, but it also had a way of giving second chances. He had survived the impossible, and now he could return fully to the life he had built, carrying the quiet pride of knowing he had made a difference when it mattered most. When his daughter finally woke and ran into the kitchen, he scooped her up in his arms. "Good morning," he said softly. "Ready to start a new day?" She nodded enthusiastically. "Yes, can we play later?" "Of course," he replied, laughing gently. "But first, breakfast." They sat together, eating, talking, and laughing. It was simple, ordinary, yet profoundly precious. He had survived chaos, faced danger, and saved lives. But in the end, the greatest joy was here, in the quiet moments with the little girl who depended on him. He looked out the window at the world outside, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. Life was unpredictable, full of challenges he could never anticipate, yet he felt ready. He had seen the worst and returned, stronger and wiser, carrying with him the knowledge that courage and care could shape outcomes in ways people often overlooked. And as he held his daughter close, he understood that the most important victories were not measured by recognition or awards, but by the safety, love, and trust of those who mattered most. The journey had been long, dangerous, and exhausting, but it had also reminded him of the man he truly was, a man who could face anything, save lives, and still return home to the life he had chosen, the life that truly mattered. And as he watched his daughter play, her laughter filling the small house with light, he knew that no matter what the future held, they would face it together, strong, resilient, and unbroken.